New Zealand house prices have been weak as bloody piss. Well, they're still ridiculously expensive, but unlike Australia, who are seeing new all-time highs for house prices, the New Zealand housing market fell sharply and hasn't recovered. And there's some startling factors that could lead to much lower house prices in New Zealand. Along with the impact to New Zealanders, this is also a huge warning for the Australian housing market and where it could be headed. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. When I was young, my family used to move around a lot, but now they're all fat. And you'll be fat with rage if you don't like this video, and subscribe if you haven't already. Yes, I know that didn't make sense, but neither does the housing market. Now let's consider what could be in store for Kiwi housing and what that could mean for Australia. Looking at the median house prices in New Zealand since 2010, we can see a steady appreciation in value all the way up until when COVID hit. Then after the tiny initial blip, we saw screaming speculation enter the New Zealand property market, taking the median value all the way up to the 900,000s. But then after the peak in late 2021, New Zealand property was sold off very sharply, with many places in New Zealand seeing declines over 20%. Now, since the very sharp declines, New Zealand house prices tried to make a slight recovery, but haven't really made up much ground at all. Because as you can see, the median house price is still a long way below the all-time highs. Compare that to the Australian housing market, which saw the same sort of craziness after COVID, a much smaller dip in prices of around only 7.5%, but since then, house prices have gone up to make new all-time highs. So the New Zealand drop in house prices was around double that of Australia, but even more worrying, the New Zealand market's basically flatlined, while Australia has seen renewed speculative frenzy for houses, sending prices sky high. Now, there's a number of factors that could be impacting this difference between the two markets, but one huge factor is interest rates, and that's what we're going to look at first. The Reserve Bank of New Zealand was one of the world's most aggressive central bank. They commenced hiking in October 2021 and have gone hell to leather, sending the cash rate all the way up to 5.25%. New Zealand have gone fast and hard with their rate hikes. In fact, my dad used to always come up to me, touch my muscles and say, "Boy, your muscles are hard. Hard to bloody find." This cash rate is actually around about the average seen in the 1990s in New Zealand. And that was before global central banks went on this rate cutting spree, creating a massive housing bubble in the process and making everyone dependent on ultra low interest rates. But unlike Australia, who raised interest rates slower and only up to a cash rate of 4.35% currently, the New Zealand central bank has balls. Big, massive, giant kahunas. Huge. Now check out the impact this has had on variable mortgage rates, with all these banks here showing a variable mortgage rate of around 8.5%. Now 8.5% is massive when you consider how expensive house prices are. And these massive mortgage rates will have a very large impact on home owners as well as home buyers. For home owners coming off fixed interest rates, the jump in their mortgage repayments is going to be astronomical. And after any savings amounts are depleted, many homeowners could really start struggling financially, and some might be actually forced to sell. But on the other hand, for home buyers, the amount that you can borrow is now drastically reduced from what it was in the early days of COVID. If you were able to borrow nearly $1 million when interest rates were near zero, currently the amount that you'd be allowed to borrow from the banks would be under $700,000. So this greatly affects how much buyers can offer for a property, and as long as overall demand for property is sluggish, it means many sellers have to reduce their price to meet what buyers are able to offer. We can see evidence of the impact of these high interest rates on new housing loan commitments. When interest rates were ultra low, look how housing loans spiked, but then they dropped off sharply, and since then have only managed a slight rise. Very interestingly, the most recent data data out of New Zealand is that prices are seeing more downward pressure and have actually started to dip again. Auckland, which has the second most expensive housing behind Wellington, is seeing some of the most downward pressure on house prices. According to real estate agency Barfoot and Thompson, they're seeing a rise in new listings, sluggish sales, and falling prices. Their number of residential sales are way below the typical average and miles below the frenzied buying seen in 2021. Listings were up by a third compared to last year, and their sale prices have started to plummet. The median Auckland selling price in January was $966,000, which is down $73,000 from a year ago, but $2,073,000 or 22% from the November 2021 peak. So New Zealand has a high level of housing stock, making it more of a buyer's market. And this seems to be the complete opposite of Australia, especially in states like Queensland, Adelaide, and Perth, where demand for housing remains at frenzied fear of missing out levels. We've seen that the New Zealand housing market is currently weak, but it could get a whole lot weaker. You see, most people were expecting that rate cuts would start to be cut due to inflation starting to ease, but Reserve Bank Chief Economist Paul Conway basically hosed down those expectations. But on top of that, New Zealand employment data was stronger than expected, and now ANZ economists believe that rate hikes, actually going up further, could be back on the cards. Sharon Zollner, the chief economist at ANZ, says that the RBNZ may lift the official cash rate to 6% over the first half of this year. And she's basing that potential on some strong consumption growth, slightly higher non-tradable inflation, and a more resilient than expected labour market. Now this really is quite astounding. New Zealand went ultra hard with their interest rate hikes, but more than that, their central bank is basically hosing down any possibility of a near-term rate cut, and top economists actually believe there could be a reasonable possibility of new rate hikes. In Australia, on the other hand, you've got politicians and the media all basically demanding that rates be cut, and that's cut from their current level of 4.35%, whereas New Zealand are 5.5%. The New Zealand central bank is a bit like this, whereas the Australian central bank is more like this. Whether or not New Zealand actually raises interest rates doesn't really matter. We now have the indication that rates are going to stay higher for longer. And when they do get cut, it may not help the housing market, as it will most likely occur due to weak economic factors. In fact, the economy in New Zealand isn't looking great and could potentially deteriorate further. Now, just like Australia, New Zealand has witnessed a sharp increase in immigration. Now, it may not be to the same level as Australia, but when you have high levels of immigration, it makes the overall GDP figures look a bit better, but overall, it often means that individuals are doing worse economically. And you can see that here by the quarterly per capita GDP growth. And per capita just means per person. So New Zealand has now seen 4 consecutive quarters of deteriorating growth per capita. And the impact of this can really be seen by the real household disposable income per person. Now, this represents a person's total income less taxes adjusted for inflation. Now, because inflation has spiked so fast over the last couple of years, the purchasing power of every dollar you earn is now a lot lower. So New Zealand house prices are weak, the economy is weak, and that will eventually lead to higher unemployment levels. Because when the economy is weak, businesses don't make as much money, so they have to reduce their expenses, which leads to increased layoffs. So over time, as unemployment levels start to rise, we could see an increase in forced selling of housing, which could end up leading to much lower house prices. Now, if the economy does start to tank in the future, that's when the central bank will look to cut interest rates. But when that occurs, it doesn't automatically mean that house prices will start going up again, because by then, everything might be turning to shit. Now, there's a warning for the Australian housing market here. It's possible the RBA hasn't been hard enough in trying to curb sticky inflation. Even though Australia has seen some relief and the price of of inflation growth has reduced, it doesn't mean inflationary pressures can't move up again. So there is potential for higher interest rates in Australia. And like we've seen in New Zealand, when you go really hard on interest rates, it has a massive impact on the housing market. Now, another thing for Australia is that they're now copping a lot of heat for the mass immigration policies that they've employed recently, which is creating ridiculous demand for housing and is one of the key reasons that house prices have returned to all-time level highs. So Australians are getting pissed because in the middle of the worst housing crisis ever, the government's opened the immigration floodgates, which has made everything so much worse, and renters in Australia have basically been abandoned and pushed towards poverty. So the government's realizing that there's increased social upheaval. They've tried to scale back on immigration. They've tried to clamp down on foreign buyers, calling for overhauls of housing policies which create speculation for property, especially policies like negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount. So the New Zealand housing market is weak but could get much weaker, while the Australian housing market is artificially strong but could be facing a smackdown in the future. I'm Biko Konstantinos.